So, thank you, Craig. So last week we started the class, and we talked about a woman who was very important and about women.
There you go. There you go. I am a Catholic.
What am I hearing? I think we're gonna mute you all.
Everyone has to mute. Yeah.
Okay, and so when you want to speak, then you can unmute, and you can come in at any point and ask a question or make a comment, and I'll be giving you some time to do that. So last week, when we began the class, the idea was what we're doing is we're looking at 12 different people who are not well known generally among most Jews or most non-Jews, but who played either very pivotal, important roles in Jewish history and in our history in general in the West, or who represent a certain idea that we often overlook in Jewish history. And we're working our way. Well, last week we started with the Torah, the stories of the women of the Torah primarily. We looked at Tamar, who was the daughter-in-law of Judah. And Judah was the fourth son of Jacob. And we looked at that representation of women in our tradition in the Torah. But we're going to be looking this week at post-Torah, what happened after the Torah. And we're focusing on one character, Samson. Now, many of you have heard of Samson. We're going to find out who read about him and what they can share, because the chapters I sent you, those of you that have been on last week, Noemi sent you the chapters. And if you're on this week, we will, hopefully Craig will capture the additional names, send them on to Noemi, and you'll receive any of the material for next week. Plus, Craig has recorded last week and this week, and they're both will be on our YouTube channel. So if you want to go back and see what last week was, you can pick it up. It's about an hour. And if you miss any of the sessions over the 12-week period that are stretched out throughout the year, you can always pick them up on the YouTube channel. So we take the Torah. The Torah ends with Moses dying on the other side of the Jordan, right? Now, when the Torah, when the discussion about what would be in the Torah took place, I hope you all understand God didn't give the Torah like with 5 books, right? Those books got written over a period of time, and they evolved into written material over hundreds and hundreds of years. And there had to be a discussion at a certain point of what would be called Torah and what would be not called Torah, right? Would be called something else. So we have a book that we call the Hebrew Bible or the Hebrew Scriptures. It's comprised of 3 sections. There's the Torah, right? The Torah, that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, 5 books. But it became 5 books when a decision was made, and that decision wasn't made until about 2,000 years ago, right? So if we think about the Torah as taking place 4,000 years ago to about 3,200 years ago, the decision about the 5 books only took place 2,000 years ago. I know these are large numbers, but that means there was over 1,000 years when we don't know how many books were in the Torah. We don't know if the next book of the Bible, of the Hebrew Bible, which is called Joshua, whether that was originally going to be in the 5 books to make it 6. In fact, we know there was a discussion about that. But that would have meant that the Torah would have ended in the promised land, right? And right now, the Torah ends before the promised land. That's a very big issue when you think about it. Our prime holy book, the Torah, does not take us into the promised land. It leaves us in the wilderness, outside the promised land. That is an ideological and a theological statement. Are you with me? Do you understand what I'm saying? Do you have any questions about that? Right? Because the revelation was understood to have ended when Moses died, and the new era began. And the new era was different than the old era. And the new era begins when we enter the promised land with Joshua. Okay, once we get into the promised land with Joshua, we now enter an era that is between Moses and King Saul, the first king of Israel. It's a period of a couple of 100 years. I mean, I say that like it's nothing. It's the entire history of the United States, right? Our entire history is a couple of 100 years. And so when I'm saying this period, it's pretty substantial, right? It's as much as our country's history. And mostly you know very little about it. And I would tell you this, nobody knows much about it. It's a very difficult period to understand. So let's start by asking the question, which of you read the chapters about Samson? You want to raise your hand if you did? Okay, so a few of you did. So one of you should begin by unmuting and tell me what you learned in reading those chapters. What did you learn about that period of Jewish history that is represented by the story of Samson? Joni, you want to start?
Yeah. So I'm talking through Gary's computer because otherwise it echoes if I use mine. So can you hear me?
Can you guys hear Joni? Okay,
Okay.
good. They can hear.
So he might have been a really strong guy, but I don't think he was the, brightest bulb in the bunch. At the end of the story, when Delilah is trying to, get the secret to his strength, she tries to trick him 3 times, and he doesn't seem to catch on. I just see him as sort of the stereotype of a caveman. I didn't find him very appealing.
Okay, so Joni's commenting on the character of Samson. What else do we know? Steve, you unmuted. You want to say something? I'm not hearing you. I don't know why, Steve. You got to put your sound up. And now you're on mute. There you go. Is your sound up? No, we're still not hearing you.
Unplug it out of it.
He has to, Steve has to unmute.
No, he unmuted, but then we still didn't hear him, Craig.
Okay.
No, we're still not hearing you, Steve. I don't know what the problem is.
Oh, now we heard him.
Can we hear you now? Steve?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yeah, we hear you. Now we got you. Okay. Now you're
Oh, now
unmuted.
I'm muted.
No, we had you. And now you unmute, now you muted again.
You're muted.
Okay, now Steve, talk to us. Steve, can you hear us?
No.
No, you
So-
can't hear us now. All right, I guess, I don't know if we're gonna solve it with Steve, so we got Stanley. Stanley will give it a shot.
Okay, I didn't appreciate before reading the article, that there were all these women that preceded Delilah. You always hear about Delilah, but I don't remember hearing about all the other women that he turned down. I guess Delilah was really something special. But like she was saying, it's interesting that he only finally, caved after 3 attempts and finally said, okay, cut my hair and so on and so forth. It was interesting. And I didn't appreciate or wasn't aware of the fact of all the incidents leading up to the fact where he was in the temple, and he pulled the temple, pulled it down, which was, to me, was interesting.
Right. So,
You-
yes, Steve, I think we hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that, guys. It's what I read about Samson. I did a little bit of other research. He was, I believe, the last of the judges. So I think there were 6 to 12 additional judges during that period of time. And it seemed to be cyclical in the sense that there would be an era of peace, and then there'd be where the Jewish people would have some level of disfavor from God, and then over this period of time, they seemed very fractured in terms of resources. So it was a very interesting time. And the story of Samson was just really, I believe he was the last judge that was part of that history.
Good. That's a good observation. We don't know if he was the last judge, but he certainly, because it's not in order, and there's a question of how scholars try to read which one was after which one. And I'm going to show you a timeline in a minute that tries to lay out some of it. But if we think of the structure of the society, so in Genesis, right, the structure was family, right, patriarchal. Abraham basically dictated what happened in his family. Isaac, even though Rebekah had a great influence, it ultimately came down to Isaac's decisions, Jacob's decisions, right? It was patriarchal and it was family. Tribes were the children and the grandchildren. That's how we were organized as a people with tribes in a big family. Once we got out of Egypt, we organized differently, right? When we were in the desert, we had an army. The tribes marched in an order. There was a religious authority, Aaron, and the Levites, right? The priests and the Levites, all of that got formulated. Moses became the lawgiver, but also the chief of the army. He was the military leader. He was the one who dictated the order. I mean, ostensibly it came from God, but it was through Moses. So it was very hierarchical, but there were these other layers because there were tribal elders, right? We know the elders existed. There are a lot of incidences. For instance, with the spies, many of you remember when Moses sends out 12 spies, he chooses, what it says is, one of the princes from each tribe. So we knew there was a hierarchy even within the tribes. We don't know what it meant. I mean, we don't have details of any of this, but we know there were levels. We know there were judges because with Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, he says to Moses, you got to appoint judges. And Moses does. So there was a jurisprudence structure. So you had law, you had military, right? You had within the tribes, and you had Moses at the head. Now, all of this was being developed in the period of the desert. But now we come into the land. And when we get into the land, at the beginning, there is a military leader. That's Joshua, right? He succeeds Moses. And he doesn't give law. So he doesn't take over that. He doesn't take over the religious leadership. He mainly leads the army and conquers with his army different parts of the promised land. Now, after Joshua is what Steve was talking about, these judges. They weren't judges in the sense that judges in a court. Some of them did judge. Some of them actually had judicial power. Some of them, like Samson, we don't see Samson judging, right? We don't even see Samson with his Jewish brethren, the Hebrews. Where does he live? mainly with Philistines, right? He's constantly engaging in Philistines. He's fighting them. He's marrying into them. He's seducing them. But almost his entire story is all about the Philistines and his engagement with them. He's called a judge, right? And then we have all these other judges. But where did he come from? I mean, he just rises, and then when he's done, there's no unification of the tribes. And then another judge arrives, and there's unification for a while of some of the tribes. So let me share a little of this timeline, and we'll take a look at this. So let's go back to the death of Moses. You see it right here? So they put it at 1406 BC. I wouldn't worry about the exact dates. For a long time, we put the death of Moses at 1250 BCE. This one puts it at 1406. But it's way back when. It's somewhere around that period. And there's a lot of discussion with all of this stuff. And you can see at the same time, God or Moses commissions Joshua. God through Moses does that. Now we have Jericho conquered and Ai. We have all that, the land being allocated to the tribes around the same time. Joshua's farewell in 1375. So if you look, Joshua comes into the scene at 1406 roughly. By 1375, Joshua was finished. Okay? Now we start to see all of the incidences that are written about in the book of Judges. And again, these are in the order that this scholar put them. It doesn't mean they're in the actual order. And you have people like Othniel, Eglon, Ehud. I'm sure most of you don't know these names, but you may know Deborah and Barak, right? Deborah is famous. We read about her. Devorah, her name is important. She's a judge and a prophetess. And she enlists Barak, who is the military leader, and they go to war. And there's a famous Song of Deborah, right? And in the Song of Deborah, there's another woman. We talked about her last week. Her name is Yael. She kills the enemy general Sisera. And Deborah is a judge, right? And then we have Gideon. And some of you may have heard of Gideon. There's a spiritual that mentions Gideon. And then we have, now this is really kind of interesting because this scholar, who obviously is Christian, puts Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz in the middle of the Judges period. In the Jewish Bible, this is not clear that it's in the Judges period. In fact, the book of Ruth falls in the third section of the Hebrew Bible called the Writings, not in the earlier section where Judges is. But it looks like if you read the book of Ruth, it seems like it might have appeared during this period. So this scholar puts Ruth and this story there. Then we get people like Yair and Samuel's birth. All of this, then we have Jephthah here, right? And these small ones, Elon and Abdon, right? All of these are dealing with the Philistines. And here's Samson. Now, Steve said he was the last one, and this one puts him at the end, right? This one puts him at the end. But all of these people, and now we're in the year 1075, right? Samson and Delilah. So let's go back. So it begins this period with Joshua's farewell address, 1375, and it goes at least until Samson and Delilah, 1075. So this one places it at a couple of hundred years, right? All these stories deal with the structure of the Jewish society. It wasn't really Jewish, it was tribal, and it was during that period. Any questions while I have the chart up? Because I'm going to take it down if there are no questions. And I can't see everybody, so you need to unmute and
How do they establish the timeline?
so part of it is the timeline is established by some of the stories, by trying to read the background literature and also who they were fighting at that time. So which were the groups that were prominent? Like here you have Gideon fighting the Midianites, right? And here you have the Philistines with Samson. So the Philistines come later. Most scholars think the Philistines came to that area later than the Midianites, who were active already during the time of the desert. So part of it is they look at what is the story describing, who are the stories describing, and what is going on, and what areas are they talking about, right? And then they try to put it into context. You know, a lot of this is I don't want to say it's guesswork, but it is guesswork. We don't have any photographs. We don't have any literature outside the Bible. We have very little archaeological evidence to help us during that period. We have some, but very little in the sense of concrete, actual evidence. For instance, none of the names that are listed here, none of them, are validated through archaeology, including Samson. The only story we have of Samson is in our Bible, right? We don't have any independent information. We don't have information about Ehud or Deborah. We don't even have it about Moses or Abraham. So we have to take the evidence as best we can take it. The earlier we're dealing with it, the more difficult it is. Right? Does that answer you, Stanley?
Yeah.
You know,
Rabbi,
yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Charles, go ahead. Is the reference to Gideon's Bible?
No, that's very funny. Right. But the name Gideon is from here. The names that we give to people today, many of them are taken from our Bible, and Gideon was one of those names that became very prominent, especially among Christians, for a period of time. Thank you for the joke, Roger.
You're
I
welcome.
didn't get a lot- Yes.
So my question is, we all accept in a broad sense the idea that God, had something to do with the writing of the 5 books, right? Whether literally or figuratively. Is the same thought that God wrote the writings and the other 2 books as well? Or is that a switch where God wrote the first book and then these were just historical, cataloging by historians and writers?
Okay. I'm going to stop share at this point so I can answer that. Charles, I want to see all of you. It's a good question and it's an important one. We don't think about this much, but just as I told you about how the Torah got formed, right? It's true about the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, as well. So all of these books that comprise the books of the Bible, Hebrew Bible, it's called Tanakh. The Taf is for Torah, the T is for Torah. The Nun is for Nevi'im or prophets. And the Chaf is for Ketuvim or writings. The writings consist of like Psalms, Proverbs. We put the book of Ruth in there, Job. There are a lot of books there as well. When that got formed ultimately, and again, that happened about 2,000 years ago, we know when the convention took place, and the rabbis actually made votes about what got in and what got out. And they took this from their own, not from their own minds, but from what they had received from before them, from what they knew from their teachers. And they decided, with the New Testament hanging around, these stories of Jesus, right? Around the 1st, 2nd century, that's when the Gospels were being written and being floated around. At some point, they said, we got to put an end to new books. People are saying these books can get in there, our holy Jewish books. And they had a whole other set of books, like the books of the Maccabees, which were already 200 years old by then. They had a lot of books that were written by Jews after the book of Malachi, which is the last of the prophets, after the book of Ecclesiastes, after all these books. There were other books. So they had a conference, and they all got together, and they pooled their wisdom, and they voted books in and out. And the books that we have were the books that got voted in. And the books, like the books of the Maccabees, got voted out. And a lot of other books got voted out. They were not considered at the same holy level as these books. But they also said all of the books of the Tanakh, of the Hebrew scriptures, are holy. They are all inspired or given by God. There are no contradictions in these books. And if we see contradictions, the problem is ours. And once those books are sealed, our job is no longer to add, but to understand. Our job is to take those books, understand them, and apply them to our lives. So there are two kind of approaches. One is halacha, law. If it says in those holy books, you shall keep the Sabbath and do no manner of work, there must be a law that will define what work is, and what is rest, and what is the difference. So can I garden in my garden on Shabbat? Because I don't garden during the week, and maybe for me that's rest. What if I'm a gardener and I garden all week for a living? Can I garden on Shabbat? So what is work? What is rest? That's halacha, that's law. And when they had to make some decisions, what's in and what's out, what is kosher? What is not kosher? What is milk? Because they came up with the notion you can't mix milk and meat. What is defined as milk? What is defined as meat? What is defined as parv? Neither milk nor meat. To give you an idea, in the early days of kashrut, chicken was parv. Now, did you know that?
No.
Well, because for about 1,000 years, chicken has been meat. But during the early years, chicken was considered like fish. Birds were considered like fish, not like meat, right? Now, all of that got changed over time because as the rabbis and as our tradition understood it, our job is to take what's in the holy books and to figure out what works for our time. And because our time keeps changing, we have to keep reinterpreting. So one aspect was halacha. The other aspect was what we call midrash. Midrash means ethics, morals, ways to live our lives, religion, spirituality. What is good for a human being to live? Not just halacha. Because, for instance, honoring your father and your mother, there is no halacha about that. There's no limit. It's not clear what that means and how to do it. There's a lot of living. What does it mean to not lie? Well, what happens if you go to a wedding and you look at the groom and you say, what a hideous man. That man is deformed and I think he's ugly. And the bride says, what do you think of my groom? Are you supposed to say what you believe? Or are you supposed to lie? This is in the Talmud, by the way. It's about a wife. I changed it. But you're supposed to, Hillel says you lie. You look at it from the bride's point of view, and you say in her eyes, he is handsome. And so you say you have a wonderful groom. He's beautiful. In her eyes, he is. So in that case, you lie. You even lie to keep shalom bayit, peace in your marriage. If you have to, you try to cover over certain things in order to stay married, to keep peace. So all of this stuff flows from the holiest of books, which is the Torah, the next holiest, which are the prophets, and the least holiest of the books, which are the writings, and they cannot contradict each other. So if I read a contradiction, the problem is mine. And that's what the commentators are doing. And that's what Midrash is doing. They are resolving these issues as best they can. Right? Now, during the period of the Torah, they didn't have that problem. Right? All they had was the revelation as it was being given. During the Judges, here's the question. Did Samson keep the Torah law? Doesn't look like it, does it?
Yeah, thou shalt not kill.
Well, and not just kill. Who did he marry? And who did he cohabit with? And what was he doing among the Philistines? And what was he taking from people? And how did he treat people? And he was lying to Delilah, right? I mean, the guy broke everything we would consider to be Jewish, the way Jews should behave. He was a bovine. I mean, he was a beast. You know, he was brutal and physical and not very nice. He wasn't a nice Jewish boy. Well, okay. But during the Judges period, as far as we know, nobody kept the Torah. Nobody had the Torah. Those laws may have been floating around, and some people may have known about some of them, but they hadn't been established as the laws of our people and the rules of our people and the guidance of our people. Many scholars today believe that didn't happen until basically the Maccabees. Imagine that. The Maccabees about 2,200 years ago. The Maccabees go to, if you want me, I'll show you that chart again and get us to the Maccabees. Let me get to that and I'll show you the Maccabees.
Rabbi, when and where was the first Bible created?
First Bible, what do you mean? Written Bible?
Yeah, well, you say these rabbis got together and they created these three books. When and where did that take place?
So that took place, as far as we know, in two areas of the land of Israel, Jaffa, today's Jaffa, and Tiberias. Look how far I'm going. Okay, I didn't even take us because this Christian didn't take us. So the Maccabees are around here in 168, in here. That's where the Maccabees are. And that's about when the Torah law started being established as the standard for Judaism, all the way down there. All that history took place without Torah being established as the standard. That doesn't mean they weren't observing some of the laws. For instance, when archaeologists dig up Jewish sites in the biblical period, they'll find pig bones in the garbage. Pig bones, which means there were Jews eating pig. But at a certain point, once we get into the pre-Maccabee period, we stop seeing pig bones. So the law is starting to infuse Judaism. We think a lot of it happened in the Babylonian captivity. Then they come back. It starts to become, with Ezra and Nehemiah, it starts to take effect. But it's not until the Maccabees establish it and say the Torah is our law that we actually start having the Torah as the standard for Jewish law. So in the Judges period, everybody, it says this, everybody is doing what's right in their own eyes. Each tribe is doing its own thing. Periodically, some charismatic leader like Samson arises and is able to influence some of the tribes. Doesn't mean he made Torah the law, just means that judge or Deborah, they were the charismatic leader for a while. And then everybody went back to doing what they did. It was a weak, diffuse kind of structure. There were tribes, there were elders. The priests were there doing something with different high places. There were Levites. We don't know exactly how they functioned, but it was this loose confederation. And periodically they'd get together to fight battles against others, sometimes against each other. But that was the middle period. It's 200 years of kind of chaos. And it's reflected in the book of Judges. And the book of Judges is probably the bloodiest, most difficult section to read of our entire Bible. And if you want to read it, you should. But it's very bloody and very awful. There are none of the values we seem to be able to talk about as Jewish. They're very hard to find there. Very hard. I thought I saw Roger's hand go up.
You did, Rabbi. Thank you. I'm just thinking though that Samson was a Noahide. That was from the Torah. This is what you do. You don't drink. You don't cut your hair. So it was kind of like a biblical commandment. It's not a commandment, but you could do this.
Oh yeah, you mean the Nazarite?
A Nazarite, excuse me. So he was a Nazarite. That was dictated in a Torah Torah section.
Right.
But also,
No, it was.
So but my point is this: have you all listened to this? Heard about the magnetic field of the Earth, and in Israel they're able to like carbon dating incidents that happened in the Bible. This guy did his PhD in it.
Right. It's fairly new. Right.
Right, and they're refuting some things that happened, and they mentioned the Philistines in there, like the Edomites. It wasn't the Philistines they fought, but that's also. I mean, if there was no Torah at this period of time, Samson followed this way.
Okay, let me clarify that. I'm not saying there was no Torah. The Torah laws existed in different forms, and they were orally being taught or passed around. I'm saying the people did not recognize the Torah as the universal law of the Jewish people. And so there were laws that they were living by that were Jewish, that we now call Jewish. But there were some laws they were ignoring entirely. As far as we know, the kashrut laws, most of the Jewish settlements of that period don't seem to reflect that. But that doesn't mean that they weren't following other aspects of what we call Jewish law today. And remember, it wasn't written down as far as we know yet. It was being taught and passed orally. And it was probably being taught and passed orally mainly among the educated. And that's a small group at that time. This is not when we have universal Jewish literacy. This is a time of farmers and shepherds. It's not even a time of merchants. It's mainly a time of barter, not so much of monetary exchange. That really hasn't taken effect in Israel at that time. It has started in the Fertile Crescent, but it's still very new. It was a time of changes constantly in governments all around the area. Sometimes the Egyptians were strong. Sometimes there was a group in the northeast that were strong. Sometimes they were being dominated. Sometimes they weren't. And the tribes were independent, but sometimes they came together. So you have to think of it as this chaotic time. The law was floating around, or parts of it. Some of it was being observed. Some of it wasn't. We don't know a great deal about this time. And that's one of the really important things to recognize. We don't know anything other than what we have in our own book of Judges. We don't have a lot. We have, again, carbon dating will help to establish certain broad ideas. We knew there were Philistines there from archaeology. We know there are Philistines. We know some things about the Philistine society. Even the Bible tells us some very important things about the Philistines. They're a big prominent group. We know they weren't circumcised, right? Because they're called the uncircumcised. That's what the Bible calls them. We know that they were big, not just Goliath. We know these were physically bigger than the Jews. It's the way that we describe them. We know their cities. By the way, one of them is Gaza. It's one of the Philistine cities in the Bible. But so was Ashkelon and Ashdod, both of whom are important Israeli cities now. So we know where they were. We have digs where we can see the kind of garments of fabric they used, the kind of pottery they had. We know that they fought battles with Egyptians. We know that they were a seafaring people, that they had ships, and that they used those ships to attack from the Mediterranean. There is a belief that they came from somewhere up in the Greek areas, that part of the Mediterranean, from near Greece, somewhere up in there. But if you think about the Jewish tribes, first of all, we don't even know if all the tribes existed during this period. Some tribes we have stories about, some we don't. Now that may be that some of them were lost, right? But even later, once we talk about the tribes, certain tribes take prominence, some tribes disappear, like the tribe of Simeon, seems to disappear from the Jewish kind of story around the time of King David and King Saul. We don't know what happened with them. Were they absorbed in the tribe of Judah? Were they a prominent tribe? Maybe they got wiped out in a war or disease. We don't know. And there isn't really yet any clear evidence. And remember, most of this period, there was nothing in writing on clay tablets that we have found. Doesn't mean we won't find something in the future. And it doesn't mean we won't detect other evidence. But right now, this period of Judges, remember, it's as long as the history of the United States. An entire chunk of our history, all we know, is what we read about stories like Samson and stories about Deborah and Gideon and just the chaos of that period. That's why eventually when we look at next week, we're not going to be looking at this period. We're going to look at kind of a different aspect of the Judges period, but not looking so much at the judges themselves, but trying to focus a little more on the laws that governed that period and the way they understood those laws and the way they understood people's values. But we're going to be leaving that period after next week, and we're going to move into the Kings period. And you can see why the people eventually came to realize they needed a king, right? They came out of the period of Moses, a strong leader and a structure. They came to Joshua, strong military leader and a structure of military which produced victories. And then they go into this independent period, right, of tribal, where they win some battles, but they're constantly being attacked and they don't have any momentum as a group. And they're struggling to define who they will be. They have a kinship with each other, but the kinship is sort of like the states of the United States, right? Some of us in Florida feel a kinship with the South. Some of us in Florida feel a kinship with the North, right? Some of us identify in the South, in Florida, with Mississippi and Louisiana and Georgia. Obviously, look at who votes and look at how the votes in this state go. And some of us vote the way New York votes and identify more with New York and New Jersey and Chicago, or with California. We identify as states in different ways and different groups within those states. And originally we were independent colonies. And eventually we realized we could not survive if we wanted to face a place like England without some unifying, cohesive system, right? And that's what forced us to try and build that. And first we had the Articles of Confederation. Some of you remember that from your high school American history, right? And it failed. And then we eventually got to the Constitution. And we formed a system. And that system was victorious over England. And then we bound ourselves to each other through the Constitution. And then we hit a period where some of those people who were part of this union felt they didn't want to be a part anymore, right? And we fought a civil war over that. So remember that, because that's what's going on here. We were tribal, like states, and we had unification, and then we became tribes. But that tribal system wasn't working so well for those people, and it took them a couple of 100 years to try and struggle with how are they going to come together. You know, Jews don't always agree. Do you notice that? It took us a lot longer than the colonies to figure out that the only way we were going to defeat the Egyptians and the Assyrians was if we could figure a way to come together. And to do that, we had to overcome our differences. And we struggle with that. And I got to tell you, we still struggle with that. And in fact, we'll struggle with that throughout our history. We will never come to a point where we all seem to agree about what is the vision of this union that we call ourselves the Jewish people. Hear, O Israel, God is one. I don't know so much about us. I'm not sure so much about us, right?
Well, you could use the analogy of the Orthodox and the Reform. They don't even accept us as Jews.
Well, you could use all kinds of different ways of, even within Reform. You know, we don't have to go very far, Stanley. You'll remember a period when Joe Narrett was the rabbi at Temple Israel, and you were forbidden to wear a kippah and a yarmulke at Temple Israel. Forbidden. They would take it off your head.
He was called Father Narrett.
Well, I understand, but I'm saying that was called Reform. Whereas at Temple Beth Shalom, at Rabbi Kronish's, you wore a kippah, and we had ushers who would put them on your head, right? I mean, and that was called Reform. We couldn't even agree about Reform, let alone agree with the Orthodox. You know, there are a lot of things we disagree with. And now we have Israel and the issues about Israel and how we disagree or how we view Israel. All I'm saying is the chaos of the Judges period very much reflects the inherent problems that we have had from the beginning. We are a family of tribes that struggles to want to come together, but can't always figure out how to do that. And sometimes we're better at it than other times. And the period of the Judges was probably one of our worst times. When we physically made war on each other, you'll see if you read the book of Judges about a story when we fought the tribe of Benjamin and the vicious nature of how a woman was treated. She was physically cut into 12 pieces and sent bodily. These pieces were sent to the tribes. I mean, you know, it's so un-Jewish when you read that, the fabric of that period. But we had to somehow get through that bloody period to get to the next stage. And once we got to the next stage, we would eventually refine ourselves into becoming what the Jewish people are still becoming. But it took us a long time. And in that ancient world, it was a very vicious and bloody world. Any questions or comments at this point? Just, Linda, you seem to want to say something. Unmute. There you go.
Go ahead.
Rabbi
Oh, hi.
Leslie. Thanks for this stimulating presentation. Earlier, you referred to the Jewish Bible. I was a little confused because by definition, isn't the ancient Bible Jewish?
The Hebrew Bible is, we call it Jewish. Christians call it the Old Testament because they say the Bible is the Old and the New. We say Hebrew Bible is our Bible, and that's the Bible. We call it a Tanakh, right? That's the name we give it. That's our acronym for it. In English, we call it the Hebrew Bible or the Tanakh. But yes, for us, that is the Bible. But for the Christians, that is not the Bible. They include all of our books and their books, right? And one of the strange things is the Quran of Islam doesn't include any of our books, but it includes a lot of our stories. So if you read the Quran, you'll read about Abraham. You'll read about Moses. You'll read about all kinds of Jewish figures, David, you know, all kinds of stories that are in the Quran. And you'll read about Jesus in the Quran.
Rabbi, if the Constitution was, say, theoretically closed out in 1789, when was the Tanakh become the Jewish Constitution, so to speak?
So we would, I mean, we can estimate, we don't know exactly, but it's about the year, if you want to take a year, about the year 90 of the Common Era. 90 CE of the first, that is after what we delineate as the year 1. It's called the Christian era, or as Christians call it, AD.
Was that the Sanhedrin? The Sanhedrin, or however you pronounce it?
Oh, the Sanhedrin. No,
Yeah.
we aren't going to get to the Sanhedrin. That's much later. It is during that period, but that'll be, so to take you through where we're going, next week, we're going to work on the end of the Judges period and the transition into the Kings. The week after that, the class after that, because they're not all straight weeks. The class after that will take us through the Kings. After that, we're going to move into the diaspora period. Then we're going to move into the rabbinic period, and the rabbinic period and the diaspora period will take us to the Sanhedrin and the rabbis. And then we're going to move into the Middle Ages and the modern era. We're going to move our way all the way through.
Great, thank you.
Okay, yes, Marty.
So in effect,
Unmute,
the
Marty.
90 AD.
Stanley, Marty wanted to speak first, and then I'll get to you. Marty, unmute. Nope, you're still muted. You gotta unmute that.
I apologize. I'm sorry.
You talked about the timeline and the time frame from the beginning of the Torah and on. The progression to me seems is the want to say the normal way of doing things, because when they started with the judges, the way I understand from what you said, the only thing they had to refer to was from the Torah. So this is the first of the beginning of somebody saying, here's the idea, this is what we're doing, and all. Now we're going into the second phase. They analyze that. Going into the third phase, they analyze that. And that's as we do in anything in life generally, I think, in a normal or regulatory way, so to speak.
Well, I think that's a nice way of putting it, and it's a clean way. I think it was a lot messier than that.
Okay.
I think we're talking about a much more chaotic period, a much more violent period.
Yeah.
I sort of equate it, for those of you that know any of the Star Trek. So the Vulcan, the land of Vulcan, where Mr. Spock, they went through an incredibly violent period until they were able to control their passions. I think of the Judges period for us as kind of that violent period that we went through, that we had to purge ourselves of in order to begin moving in a more, what you just described, a more kind of regimented area that gave us a structure.
Yeah. Oh, no, I agree. It's that the period had to be violence, because this is the first beginning of talking and anything else.
Right, but remember, the desert period was not as violent, and the period of Joshua was not as violent, because they had a strong leader that could control them. Now, Stanley.
Thank you.
So I'm just trying to understand. So the Tanakh, in effect, came into being in Jaffa in roughly 90 AD.
Yeah, roughly. That was the convocation. That all that did was that sealed it. It wasn't like it didn't exist before.
No,
It's
but
like
they put
said,
it
this far and no further. This is the end of it. We're cutting it off. And all the other books after it are now in a different category. They're not holy. They are different, and they are not of revelation. And we can treat them differently. And so we didn't even preserve the books of the Maccabees. It was the Catholic Church that did that for us. And then eventually we started looking at it and saying, oh, that's our story. Look they've got all this stuff, these books that we are our history. By the way, and we'll talk about this another time. Steve, did you want to speak? I see you were unmuted.
No, I'm okay. Thanks.
So we'll talk about this another time. I'll just finish with this. Jews never wrote history until the 19th century. Think of this. We wrote almost everything. We wrote law, we wrote literature, we wrote poetry, we wrote prayers, we wrote philosophy, we wrote science, we wrote math. We were involved over the generations in almost everything, but we never wrote history until the 19th century.
Why?
We're going to talk about that. So I'll see you next week, and we'll move on. And those of you who are on now, you should be receiving from Noemi early next week some of the reading. Okay?
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Mhm.